Syeda, Abida, Hussain, and Sahar Shafqat to take their places on stage. Our moderator for this session is Rashed Rahman. We will start as soon as we have everyone on stage.
There is a rather onerous duty being placed on me regarding Sabeen Mahmood, who, as you probably all know, was shot dead last night in Karachi. Sabeen Mahmood was a Pakistani human rights activist and NGO worker. She was director of the Karachi-based cafe, the second floor, T2F. And yesterday, on 24th April, she was shot dead by unidentified gunmen while on her way home after attending a seminar. I would like us to observe, if possible, a minute's silence in her memory, and then I would invite Sahar to say a few words on Sabeen, and then we can get straight to the seminar. We have Syeda Abida Hussain with us now. We are just about to observe a minute's silence in memory of Sabeen Mahmood, who was killed last night. Sahar will say a few words on her, then we'll proceed, okay? A minute's silence, please. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. If that is the sense of the House, yes, why not? Okay. This is not a controversy that I want here, please, if you don't mind. This is a tragic incident. We are all very saddened by it. And I think we should respect her memory by acting in a way that is respectful, rather than getting into an argument amongst ourselves. I knew Sabeen Mahmood a little. She'd been to my house in Lahore. I've been to T2F. I'm deeply grieved and saddened by what has happened. And the context, perhaps, some of you know, the seminar was on Balochistan, and it was a sort of sequel or a follow-up to the cancelled seminar that was supposed to be held in Lums on the issue, which, as it so happens, I was supposed to moderate. But that was cancelled, and now this one has led to this tragedy. Sahar, I'd like you to say a few words about Sabeen, please, and then we can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. I should confess a couple of things before I get started. One is that I am really in shock, and so I'm still a little numb. And so I ask for your patience as we get through the panel today. The second thing I should also confess is that I was intending to cancel and pull out of today's panel out of anger and protest at Sabeen's assassination. And that had been my intention actually until this morning, and then I thought about what Sabeen would want. And while I'm angry, and I'm still very angry, I don't think this is going to ever go away, this anger. If you didn't know Sabeen, let me tell you that she would want me to be here. She would want this to go on. She was assassinated yesterday after a panel that had unsilencing in its title. And so I think silence was not an appropriate response to her assassination. So that's why I'm here. I also wanted to just say a few words, especially for those of you who do not know Sabeen. Sabeen was a friend, but that's not why I'm sad. I have my personal loss. All of us who knew her personally, we are grieving her as a friend. But that's not the loss that everyone here should be furious about. The loss that we should be furious about is the silencing of free expression, of freedom of thought, of asking uncomfortable questions of everyone, not just of each other, but of our government, of our military establishment, and asking questions about everything. No topic should be taboo. And that's what Sabine stood for. And that's what we all need to stand for now. We all need to rise up with one voice and demand our constitutional rights of free expression and just the ability to ask questions, to have debates without the fear of being killed. That is not a very big thing to ask. But unfortunately, last night has proven that in Pakistan, that is actually the most dangerous thing to ask. So I want to thank Rashed Saab, and I want to just thank Sabine again for everything that she did. She provided a platform, the second floor, for many, many years, for freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and really a space that brought thousands of us together. Even if we didn't know her personally, we've all been touched by her. So I hope that you will all join all of us in demanding free expression from our state and tell our state and our military establishment to back off, because these are our constitutional rights. I also want to mention that there's going to be a remembrance and tribute to her at 3:45 today, and I hope everyone will attend. And there's also going to be a statement that I invite all of you to sign. We're still drafting it, but please, every person of conscience, I hope, will be compelled to sign that statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. The original plan was that the organizers would first introduce me and then I would introduce the panel. But since things have gone a bit the other way, I think I'll introduce myself and let the panelists introduce themselves. I think that might be easier. I'm Rashed Rahman. I'm the editor of Daily Times. I think that should suffice. Sahar, would you like to introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
My name is Sahar Shafqat. I'm a professor of political science. I teach in the United States at St. Mary's College of Maryland, and I'm currently based at Habib University in Karachi. I do research on civil society, and I'm currently working on a project on the lawyers' movement in Pakistan.
Thank you, Sahar. Anatol, please.
I'm Anatol Lieven. I used to be long ago. Oh, sorry. I'm Anatol Lieven. I used to be correspondent for the London Times here in Pakistan a very, very long time ago. Since then, I've been various things. I'm now a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, and a few years back, I wrote a book on Pakistan, essentially on power in Pakistan, called Pakistan, a Hard Country.
Thank you, Anatol. Syeda Abida Hussain needs no introduction, I'm sure, but nevertheless.
Abida is my name. I've had the privilege of representing 3 times in the National Assembly of Pakistan. All 3 times I was elected by the popular mandate. I've also had the privilege of representing Pakistan in Washington very briefly, and I've had also the privilege of chairing the district council of my district, which is Jhang in the Punjab. I've recently written a book called Power Failure, which is on sale within this compound.
Thank you. Well, life must go on. Sabine's is another wound, another scar, another tragedy. But life must go on, we must go on, I suppose, the struggle must go on. And one of the struggles that I think Pakistan's history is witness to is the struggle for democracy. Now, democracy certainly begins with elections, doesn't end with them. In our case, because elections have not been something that happened regularly in our lives, the sense of continuity and the institution building that flows from there is lost. We, in recent years, are trying to recover that and get back onto a much more normal track. In the meantime, today's panel will discuss somewhat the background history of the electoral process in Pakistan, I suppose. I don't want to dictate to them. but also the aspect which of late has once again reared its head on the radar, and that is the question of manipulated or rigged elections. As you know, Mr. Imran Khan and the PTI made quite a song and dance about it. It's now in the Judicial Commission, so I won't say more, but certainly this is not something that is new. This is not something that is unique to the 2013 elections. These kind of allegations and accusations are very much part of our political history, but I shall leave it to the panelists to enlighten you much more on that. And I think the best person to start, since she is one of the pioneers in terms of a woman being elected to local bodies elections, through local bodies elections, and then eventually ending up in parliament and various other things, I invite Syeda Abida Hussain. Give us some introduction to the question, please. Thank you.
Elections are a physically extremely demanding exercise. All electors or voters anywhere in our country, as indeed in any country of the world, want interpersonal contact with their candidates. And because we are a very heavily populated nation, even our local constituencies are large, and it means reaching out to a few thousand people. In the case of provincial and national elections, it means reaching out to a few 100,000 people. So obviously candidates try their best to optimize contact through leaflets or posters or now telephone messages, SMS messages, and so on. But there is no substitute for that interpersonal handshake or salam that you exchange as candidate to voter. In fact, a great American politician once said that politics is a whole lot of heartaches, handshakes, and headaches. Now, having said this, let's talk about what really is at the core of the electoral process, and that is the issues involved. In our political culture, which has A, tended to be interrupted every now and then, and B, is reflective of our societal construct, the issues aspect very often becomes the least important. The most important is local rivalries, clan loyalties, and local demands and local issues. So the nature of our elections tends to be locality based, whether this is local for local representative institutions or for parliament. I'm afraid the story is compounded by an unfortunate decision that was taken way back in 1985, and it still maintains, and that is to give development funds to parliamentarians for spending on development programs and projects in their constituencies. This takes away the parliamentarians' focus from the essential task of parliament, which is lawmaking, which is why perhaps we find that a lot of our legislation is slipshod. Even some of our constitutional amendments are virtually defy implementation. So I have been since 1985 an advocate of development issues being retained by the local councils and legislation being the only task of the provincial and the national assemblies.
Are you suggesting that because these development funds were handed over to the parliamentarians, that they somehow impact on the credibility, transparency, or the fairness of the electoral process?
That's right, Rashed. Transparency becomes the big issue. When the Member of Parliament has to decide where a village is to be electrified or where a road is to be built, and the actual work is to be conducted by a contractor, the contractor will make an offer to the representative to of a certain percentage of the profit in order for him to get the contract.
So it's a nexus of corruption, you're saying?
That's right.
Between the politician who wishes to be elected or is elected and the people who are interested in getting government contracts.
Correct.
Okay. I think we should move on because we'll return to this. Anatol, since you are the person on this panel who's had a fair deal of look at the military in Pakistan, your book indeed revolves a lot around that question. And since the military has been center stage in our history and in our politics, I think that's undeniable. How has that impacted on our political culture, and in particular on the interrupted, not so consistent, not so steady electoral process?
Well, clearly, what the military has provided repeatedly over the years is this belief, in often very large sections of the population, that there is a magical solution. If I may say so, one of the things that one has seen over the years, again and again, is this belief that somehow there is a magical key that can solve Pakistan's problems, without the grinding, appallingly difficult work necessary, to change things. And of course, the political parties have been guilty here as well by promising. You noticed perhaps that corruption disappeared in 90 days after the last elections in the relevant areas of the country.
Like load shedding.
Indeed. So this has, I think, helped to sustain this dream that there are alternatives to people working together, for the development of the country. A dream which the military itself has, of course, greatly encouraged, and has been helped to do so by the fact that internally, indeed, in what it does, the military works pretty well. Put it in charge of the whole country, and not since Ayub Khan has the military actually made any difference, really, to the fundamental issues of state development.
Arguably, in some cases, worse?
In some cases worse, in some cases better. It's not that the political record has often been stellar either. Now, when it comes to the interrupted elections, I think there are two things to say here. One thing is that there was another magical key, which one heard again and again, that, one only needed one legal democratic transition, from one elected government to another, and things would be transformed. That was another magical key, and seen so many countries. I often refer to the Philippines, for example, where indeed you've had a continuous, process.
Been there, done that.
Been there, done that, and it doesn't necessarily change anything. On the other hand, I think that that is not to say that interrupting elections is a good idea. Because I think that what hopefully one is now beginning to see, although with huge qualifications, which I could go into, is that what a regular and, of course, accepted electoral process, because you alluded, of course, to the fact that there have been regular challenges to the legitimacy of the process by participants in the process. But what ideally a continuous, democratic process can help to do is build a basic consensus, not among everybody, but among the most important parts of society, about the legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of the political order. That then will hopefully keep dissension about policy and so forth within certain bounds. It is, if you like, a recipe against civil war, a recipe against the disintegration of the system. And I hope that as a result of now the establishment of a regular democratic process, long may it continue, that we may be beginning to see that. But of course, there are the qualifications. One is, of course, if too many of the participants themselves undermine the legitimacy of the process by continually challenging the results, then that will undermine the democratic process, because of course many people will not see it as in fact democratic. The other thing, of course, is that if too many of the politicians make promises which are too grandiloquent and then do not in fact fulfill enough of them or any of them, then equally the population will lose any faith that democracy produces what it is after all meant to produce, which is a responsiveness of government to the needs of the population. And you alluded to all the other things that have to come with elections before democracy can be firmly established.
Thank you, Anatol. When I glance back at Pakistan's history, the thing that strikes one, it's inescapable, is number one, the infrequency and irregularity of the electoral process, because we had problems framing constitutions and various other issues like that. But the one time, ironically under a military dictatorship, when what was then United Pakistan, East and West, held an election that was not challenged in terms of credibility, transparency or fairness. That was the 1970 election. But what transpired was that instead of accepting the mandate of the 1970 election, which was the first election in Pakistan, by the way, on the basis of one man, one vote. All elections before that were on the parity principle, 1 unit West Pakistan equals East Pakistan, although the population in East Pakistan was greater. Whatever the wisdom of our leaders who built that construct, by the time you open the gate to what is the central principle of democracy, i.e. one man, one vote, and then that military dictatorship refuses to accept the outcome of that election, the mandate of that election, and we have crackdown, civil war, and the loss of East Pakistan. So it's ironic that the one election that nobody disputed ended up in the breakup of the country. All other elections have been disputed, as far as I can tell, to a greater or lesser degree. So much so, 77 election produced a crisis in the country because the allegations of rigging produced a movement against Mr. Bhutto's government, and he was eventually overthrown by a military coup. But I'm taking too long. I want to get to Sahar. Sahar, you are much more qualified than I am to dilate on this dilemma. And I've alluded to two things here. One, I've repeated the reference to the irregularity and the fact that, elections really have not happened the way they should have happened or as regularly as they should have happened. The second is how the federal structure of the state was impacted by the one election that wasn't disputed and eventually ended in the breakup. And third, and more importantly, and I think we want to get to grips with this now, is how exactly rigging, manipulation, distortion of the electoral process has been taking place in Pakistan or may still be taking place in Pakistan, and what, if possible, very briefly, is the solution to that?
That's an easy question, Rashed sir. So I'm not sure if there will be any solutions in what I have to say. But let me actually, if I may, step back a little bit. and go back to what Rashed Saab started the discussion with, which is when he said that democracy begins with elections but certainly does not end with it. In political science, we say that elections are a necessary but not sufficient condition of democracy. So elections are a necessary evil, if you will. We have to have elections if we want democracy. But that doesn't mean that just by having elections, we have fulfilled the conditions of democracy. Therefore, the quality of our elections absolutely has to be such that we all believe reasonably, all of us, as Anatol just said, that whatever result has been produced from this election is more or less correct. It is more or less fair, more or less acceptable to everyone. Rigging has been a part of the problem with that. That is, so rigging has happened always in Pakistan. It probably will continue to happen, and therefore I'm not sure I can offer solutions exactly. But I think a big part of why elections are not considered completely legitimate in Pakistan is this interruption that we've always had. What we need, first and foremost, is the continued practice of having elections. And I'm actually one of the ironic things, actually, maybe that I came here to say was that I'm actually very optimistic about the electoral process in Pakistan, and there are a couple things that I want to say about this. Number one, the term that the last government completed. It was the first full term that any government completed. And what was even more remarkable in some ways is that they were voted out through the electoral process, and that electoral process and that campaign actually turned on some very ordinary issues. There were issues of, certainly security was one of them, but there were issues about load shedding, energy shortage, those kinds of things. And those are exactly the kinds of issues that democracy should be debating in the electoral process and demanding some answers from elected representatives. And I think that the 2013 elections, whatever its shortcomings, went a very long way towards establishing that. The other thing, which I think is heartening, the other thing that I think we are still evolving in Pakistan is this notion, right, that we have about elections, which is that I, as a voter, get to go to the election, to the voting booth, and I get to exchange my vote, decide among a number of candidates, and in exchange for that vote that I will give to one of the candidates, I will get something in return. I will get bijli, or I will get pani, or I will get security, or I will get higher GDP growth, or whatever our pet issues are. And unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, but especially because elections have been interrupted continuously in Pakistan, that is just not how elections have worked in Pakistan. This notion that we are these constitutionally empowered citizens who get to exchange our vote for things that the state will provide us just unfortunately has not existed. And therefore that relationship that democratic citizens have with their state has simply not evolved in Pakistan. It is that relationship that I'm actually somewhat optimistic about that is beginning to evolve. And one last sort of piece in that, certainly not the only piece, but one last piece in that has to do with a rising middle class in Pakistan. By some accounts, this is as high as 80 million people, but even at the lower end, this is a really significant new political force in Pakistan, which thinks differently about politics, and it demands things now from the state in a way that poor rural people have unable to be in a position to ask for. And I think that this means actually that the state is now slowly being forced actually to respond to, again, the sort of the normal electoral demands that normal democracies experience. And I see this as a very, very good, I see this as a very good step.
Thank you, sir. There's a subtext here about what people's expectations are from democracies and what they're expected to deliver. But long before we get to that argument, I think we need to wade through the argument about the electoral process in Pakistan and all its shortcomings. I personally would like Abida to dilate on the perception that there's been a great deal of intervention, interference, rigging even, by the military establishment, its intelligence agencies, the deep state as it's called. How far is that responsible for the rather uneven record of the electoral process in Pakistan? How much of the blame can be ascribed to politicians? You mentioned local. Politics is local. Politics is local everywhere. But how far is it the response, or how far can the burden of proof or responsibility be put on politicians, candidates who themselves at the local level attempt to manipulate the electoral process in their favor?
You know, Rashed, broadly speaking, the establishment in our country, both civil as well as military, are extremely comfortable with public representatives that may have some capacity and that may have the ability to question what the civil servant or the military autocrat may be doing with public resources.
I'm surprised. I thought you were going to say they're comfortable with politicians who don't ask those questions.
No, they are extremely uncomfortable with politicians who ask the questions. And they are relatively comfortable with those that don't. So it is in their collective interest that politicians with less capacity and larger appetites emerge through the electoral process. Now, there's no mystery to how votes are put together. At the polling station, voters will cast their vote in the box. At the when the voting is ended, the presiding officer, along with assistant presiding officers, in the presence of representatives of the candidates called polling agents, count the votes and put them in different bags, a different bag for each candidate. These bags are then put in vans and taken to the district headquarters and to the returning officer. A returning officer is usually an additional sessions judge. Now, elections is an administrative exercise, and there's a flaw, I believe, in our constitution where we have involved the judiciary in our electoral processes. It should be left to the administration, as is the case in India, where they don't really have complaints of rigging since quite some time. The additional session judge, as presiding officer, has those bags dumped in his chamber in the courtroom, and usually he is presiding officer for 3 constituencies. So a few 100,000 bags are dumped on the floor of his room, which is often not very large. And there are all sorts of people that are milling around, supporters of the candidates and orderlies and
interested parties.
Interested parties of all kinds. So in that milieu, for a bag to be quietly opened and for additional ballot to be dumped into it, or for ballot to be taken out of it, is really very doable. And this does happen because during the election campaigns, the covert apparatus of the state representatives are in very close touch with the local administration. And then they also get in touch with the candidates. And the candidates, for fear that they be handicapped, lest they be handicapped, they're available to talk to these people. And so they are asked, what do you want to do when you are elected, etc. And they will say, Sir ji, just aap hukam karenge type of answers. So, but these people are not stupid. They make fairly shrewd assessments. And the ones who are greedy and the ones who are not focused on the well-being of the people, as it were, are the ones that get the votes added. Now, in this book that I've recently written, I've written a small anecdote. In the local elections of 2005, during the tenure of Parvez Musharraf, the local elections had just started, and I was in my district in the town of Chang, and people were milling around the house to talk about candidature in different constituent units. When I got a phone call, and the caller said he was Colonel so-and-so of the ISI, and he wished to see me. So
Not the same colonel who keeps calling me, I hope.
we'll have to share names. So I said, Colonel, can I stop you? But the irony was lost on him, and he said, I'll be there in 15 minutes. So two brand new Land Cruisers drove in, doubtless from the coalition support funds.
No doubt.
And a major stepped out of one and a colonel out of the other. So I was sitting out in the veranda with my callers, and I asked them to be seated and carried on the conversation. After a few minutes, the colonel became impatient and he said, Madam, can we speak with you separately? So I took him and the major into my sitting room, and there are a lot of historic photographs in those rooms. So both the officers were looking at them with great interest. And then the colonel said, Madam, this is history. This is history. Madam, our assessment is that you're the best person to run this district. So I have come to say that you must contest for Nazim Zilla. So I said, Colonel, tell me, would you like to serve as a captain again? He said, excuse me. I said, look, I chaired the district council 30 years ago. Even my daughter has chaired the district council more recently. Why would I want to do a job I did all that time in the past? Why can't you think of me as a possible chief minister or a prime minister? So he said, fair question, madam, fair question. You have the grooming, you have the background. But there is one problem, madam. You don't own textile mills and sugar mills. So there it is. This is why the leadership of Pakistan is textile mills and sugar mills. If you are the proud owner of textile mills and sugar mills, you can be squeezed at any time through your bankers. And so I rest my case with this, that broadly speaking, the establishment does interest itself in who should be elected. And to concretize my argument, I will dare to suggest that in the 1985 election, the big dhandli that General Zia did, of course, was that he didn't allow parties to contest. But if you contested as an individual, they didn't really care who won. So what do we find? Out of our current crop of leaders, the majority are folk who were elected in 1985.
Very good point, and I'm very happy to be educated as to the qualifications to be Chief Minister or Prime Minister of this country. No, it's very important, because in years past, when I was growing up, the received wisdom was he had to be a big landowner. So we made the transition from feudalism to capitalism, at least. Anatol, you've heard Abida, and I think you yourself, through your research, have established, there's a reference to India. The struggle for an independent election commission in India is a long one, and I think it was finally achieved. Isn't that what is missing in Pakistan? If we had an independent election commission which would not submit to dictation or blandishment and ran us through an electoral process regularly, consistently, fairly, that we might actually get somewhere?
Before answering that, I'd perhaps just like to endorse something that you said about the importance of actually relatively small-scale practical issues in the latest elections. And what I said yesterday about the governments in Punjab and KP having, done something in a smallish but nonetheless significant way to improve, practical way to improve the responsiveness of government institutions to the people, because that, I think, is a great sign of maturity and progress in democracy. As to the need for an independent election commission, I agree entirely, and I've been struck in India. I was a student in India before I came to Pakistan as a journalist after Cambridge. And the quality of Indian elections, I mean, the results were, in the end, were generally more or less accurate, reflecting the will of the people. But the quality of the elections themselves was often abominable. I mean, the degree of, the capturing of polling stations, the accusations of ballot stuffing, by, not there by the top state institutions or, of course, the Indian military, but by local politicians and their followers themselves. And there has been a great improvement in the quality of that, which I think exactly Pakistan could and should study. On, of course, the rigging of the elections, though, it is necessary both that, obviously, in principle, the military and the ISI should withdraw from the process, but of course one must also say that there is need for an improvement in the democratic consciousness of many of the politicians themselves. In the election in Karachi yesterday, of course, there were suspicions both that the military establishment might play a role, but also, of course, the leading party in Karachi has a notable history of organising, shall we say.
Obviously, whether they did play a role or not, the party that has a stronghold in that constituency won.
It won, and it looks as if it won fair and square. But it was also notable, of course, that many people were, in effect, also simultaneously fearing military intervention and looking to the Rangers to both maintain order and to prevent, explicit rigging by force. So this is, alas, a very complicated process that requires the development of democracy all round, shall we say.
Thank you, Anatol. I'd like our third panelist to give us a perspective. There's an interesting point you made, that really the 2013 election was much more about what is called in the United States pork barrel issues. Ordinary things that people desire, that they want. They want the politicians to deliver. And I take the point also that the performance of the politicians in office or during the electoral process has a great deal to do with the credibility of the process itself and whether delivery takes place, and therefore how much room it leaves for intervention by people who shouldn't be intervening. Your comment, please.
So whether the credibility of the elections allows the people who shouldn't intervene to intervene, or?
I'm saying that if the performance is poor, it leaves more room for intervention, and is that justifications trotted out for it. Look what the politicians have done. If the politicians perform better, perhaps that would fade away over time.
Yes.
Fingers crossed.
Yes. I understand. So, of course, the easiest, the most common, frequent excuse for dismissing assemblies, most of us know this, is blaming corrupt politicians. And I think what Rashed Saab is alluding to is that, unfortunately, many of our politicians have made this easy by being corrupt. And so that yes, your point is.
And even incompetent.
And even incompetent, but I do want to push back on that a little bit. I think competence can be spread out quite widely in Pakistan among all institutions, including the military. So I think competence is a bit overstated sometimes for our politicians. I'll just repeat what I said earlier. Yes, you're right. Politicians, I think we want our politicians, our civilian politicians, to perform better, to give fewer excuses to extra constitutional forces to intervene. But, in some ways, I have a lot of sympathy as well for our civilian politicians, which is, and that's because, in some ways, their path to power has never been guaranteed through the electoral process. And which is the same, and the same is true of our voters, right? That our access to state resources has not been ever really guaranteed through the electoral process. And you asked earlier for solutions. Unfortunately, there is no solution to this problem other than to keep doing this exercise again and again and again until everyone starts to accept that that is the only way that politicians can come in and out of office, that voters can get our state to respond to things, to demands and our concerns. And I think that is the best way, honestly, to keep extra constitutional forces out of the process, is by simply insisting on having the process again and again. I know that many of us are frustrated because we perhaps sometimes get civilian leaders from our electoral process that we're not thrilled with. I get it. I understand. Everybody's frustrated. But there is no solution. There is no alternative to actually sticking with it.
Thank you. Obviously, you have to wade through the process. I'm not denying that. But I want to quote two examples from our history. In 1954, there was a provincial election in East Pakistan. Muslim League was in power, and they did their utmost to win there. But they lost, despite holding state power. And in 1970, whatever the expectations of the military regime, the results turned out very different. So, what does that tell us? That no matter how much manipulation and rigging takes place, whether from the deep state or from politicians, locally or nationally, if it's an aware electorate, mobilized behind a program or a manifesto that it owns, appropriates, then perhaps the best riggers in the world will be defeated. And here, therefore, I'm going to turn to our aware audience for questions on this issue. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, sir. So my question is that in the beginning, there was sort of discussion on the factors which have sort of undermined the democratic process in Pakistan, but there was one sort of great elephant in the room which nobody discussed, and that was religion. You've got to say you're a Christian or a Hindu in this country, you can aspire aspire to the highest office in the land. You still have a minority in this country, and I'm not even, perhaps after all the discussion on Fatiha, going to mention their name, who are still on a separate electorate. And you're talking about the growth of the middle class and stuff, but that growth really plays into the mainstream, the sort of mainstream Muslim population. And until you re-enfranchise sort of every strata and every aspect of your society, you really can't have a full democratic process. So people are talking quite optimistically that, you keep on having elections and organically this will improve. But to re-enfranchise the non-Muslim population in this country, you need actual constitutional and legal reform, and that's something much harder to come by. So my question is, how do you see this sort of part of the democratic process playing itself out? Thank you.
Very good question, very good point. I would like the panel to respond because I think it goes to the heart of what this state is about. Is it inclusive? Is it an inclusive democracy or an exclusive democracy?
I mean, two parts of the question first. I think that Pakistan has to be a pluralist democracy. To be brutally honest, at least as far as Islam is concerned, as the Muslim population is concerned. I think I'm sorry to keep referring to the Middle East where I now live, but I think one has seen in the Middle East the catastrophic consequences of trying to define any state in exclusive religious communal terms. Trying to do that in Pakistan would destroy this country, because it is actually a pluralist country culturally, religiously, in that way. And that, by the way, is one reason why, thank God, the militant extremists will not and cannot triumph, because it's not that kind of country. If they did, God forbid, they would only triumph for a day before the country would disintegrate. Now, most unfortunately, as far as the non-Muslim religious minorities are concerned, you're absolutely right, sir. They have been, in effect, excluded and marginalized. What, however, and I find it very difficult, practically speaking, to believe that they will play a members will be allowed to play a leading political role in the foreseeable future. I wish it were different, but I can't really imagine that. What, of course, they have the right to demand, absolutely as part of the whole process of building not just a democratic state, but a working legal state, what the Germans called a Rechtsstaat in this country, is the full protection of the law, the full and equal protection of the law for minorities, but for everybody else as well. Because, of course, not just the differential and often grossly biased, but also the sheer the anarchy of the law in Pakistan, and the competition, of course, between different legal orders, but also something that has played such a big role in the rise of extremism in Swat and other places, is the incompetence and corruption of the legal order in this country, and the degree to which the legal order too has become part of what I call the negotiated state in Pakistan, where the law is not in fact followed, everything is a matter of negotiation and compromise, pressure, money. And as part of the growth of democracy, that is also, and the legitimization of the democratic state in Pakistan, that is also something that has to change. With it, I must absolutely say, the absolutely gross misuse and abuse of the blasphemy laws, for example, as a key example.
Can I add to that,
yes,
please? I want to thank you for your question. Thank you very much. And I think that I'm much less optimistic about that front. It is a matter of absolute shame the way that our non-Muslim Pakistanis are treated. They are not equal before the law, and that requires constitutional reform. I do not feel hopeful about that kind of reform coming through the electoral process. Because it's really the Constitution that needs to be amended. As you know, there are there's constitutionally based discrimination against non-Muslim Pakistanis. That also requires a change of mindset among all of us. We have to start seeing non-Muslims as equal Pakistanis. And as one of us, not as the other. So it requires social change as well, but I think it requires constitutional reform, and I'm not sure the electoral process is the way to go, or at least I'm not as optimistic about that.
Can I just say that?
Abida, would you agree?
How will that impact on the future demographic process?
Okay, we'll get Abida to focus on that.
I think that this separate electorate question has not played well, and what we do need is to re-amalgamate. That would, of course, deny representation in all probability to our Christian and Parsi and Hindu representatives. But in the long run, that would probably be better. But as I heard the question, I think the questioner was also suggesting that too much of our political space is taken up by mainstream religion. And that is so. We have, of course, the religious political parties, and the religious political parties always play a consequential role, particularly in the Pashtun areas of KPK and Balochistan. And they hold almost all governments to ransom. Sadly, the trend to drag religion into politics is on the increase. And now it has even got to the issue of sect within the mainstream religion. So all of this is a part of, I suppose, the world around us, but we can take solace from the reality that we are better off than our Arab brethren.
I'm not sure how much of a compensation that is. Gentleman over there. Oh, lady, sorry.
Actually, I asked this question as a layperson, and how much importance would you give to the factor of accountability of our politicians? Because the attitude of doing what they wish to do with impunity and not being punished for it or being hauled up before the law seems to be a factor in their favor. And with the negotiations, that I like that word, that goes on, there seems to be a very, very long way to go before these people can be gotten rid of or be sort of be forced to account for their misbehavior and follow the law and sort of represent the people rather than their own interests or their foreign masters or what have you.
Anyone like to respond on that? Accountability.
Well, of course, the accountability of the politicians is critical, and I talked about accountability in the sense of keeping at least some of the promises that they've made in the elections. When it comes to accountability in the area of corruption, shall we say, in its various forms, and other illegal actions, but probably with corruption as part of the patronage system, as it's as the single most important issue. Well, of course, everybody in Pakistan, and one can talk about this in other countries as well, everybody hates corruption, except when they don't. And of course, one way I'm afraid of looking at the Pakistani state and Pakistani politics, it could be regarded essentially as an organized conspiracy of a very, not of everybody, but of a very, very large part of the population not to pay taxes. Which is why Pakistan raises, so much less of its taxes even than other countries in South Asia, because it is, I fear, to some extent, a deal between the political classes, including the military when they're in power, and very large sections of the population. Of course, the elites to start with, naturally, but others as well. Whereby the population will let the politicians get away with it, and the politicians, when in power, will not enforce taxes on the population. As a result of which, perhaps people in many ways live better in Pakistan than they might otherwise, but you're not going to get a decent education system, a decent infrastructure system, a decent health system out of a system like that.
I'm being signaled that we have perhaps just 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to suggest is, can we have the questions and then maybe we can respond in one go? That might be better. Gentleman there, you sir, I think there was a lady at the back there. One here. I don't know if you can answer all those. Yes, madam. Let's get all the questions in, then we can perhaps respond.
Thank you so much. My question is to Sahar. As we're talking about the rigged elections again and again, what role you see of electronic media? Are they making people aware of about their leaders, that they are doing accountability of these leaders? And that's why the previous election, I mean, the people, although People Party, they completed their 5 years, but instead of that, they haven't selected the same leaders and they brought a new party. So what is the role of electronic media, especially in this regard?
Yes. Briefly, please. We are running too short of time.
मैं उर्दू में बात करूंगा।
जी उर्दू में करें, लेकिन briefly.
मुझे बहुत ब्रीफ कह दिया गया, एक्सक्यूज कर दिया गया टाइम के लिहाज से, तो वो ख्यालात जो हैं वो फिर इधर उधर हो जाएंगे। मुझे शक है पाकिस्तान की सियासी पार्टियों पर और लीडरशिप पर कि उनको जमहूरियत से कोई ज़रा सी मोहब्बत भी है। मेरे शक की एक ठोस वजह, वो कहते हैं ना, चैरिटी बिगिंस एट होम। ये सब लीडर जमहूरियत के लिए मर रहे हैं, कुर्बानियाँ दे रहे हैं, दिन रात राग अलाप रहे हैं, लेकिन उनकी पार्टियों के अंदर जमहूरियत का एक कतरा नहीं है। मैं वो वोटर हूं जिसको सिर्फ वोट देने का हक है। मैं पूरे 5 साल मुंह खोल के देखता रहता हूं इस दफा किसको टिकट मिलेगा। मुझे जब तक टिकट जारी करने का इख्तियार नहीं दिया जाएगा, यही निजाम अमेरिका ले जाएं, हमसे ज्यादा बदतर करप्ट साबित होंगे वो। पार्टी के अंदर इलेक्शंस के लिए आप नहीं मर रहे, आप झूठ बोल रहे हैं, आपका जमहूरियत से इश्क जो है वो झूठा है।
थैंक यू। इधर प्लीज, हैंग ऑन, don't get so anxious.
No, I don't think I have time to even make out a question.
No,
just
please.
For reflective thinking, I'm an educator. Just for everybody's knowledge, I think a lot of people don't have this knowledge. Our children are allowed to vote when they're 18 years old. Now, in the textbooks of the metric syllabus, even the O-level syllabus, there is just a mention of the Constitution without going into any even surface detail about what a constitution is supposed to be. You spoke about mindsets, and until the educated populace of this country has the tools to develop a mindset, I don't think it's possible. Just for you to reflect on.
Thank you. This anxious gentleman here.
Syed Manzoor Kaka Khail ji. After just 10 months of the creation of this country, Qaid-e-Azam, while addressing Staff College Quetta, I hope I would not be treated as a traitor. ये inverted commas हैं, Qaid-e-Azam के अल्फाज हैं मेरे।
I hope you're not going to quote the whole speech because we don't have time.
No sir. While interacting with one or two high-ranking officers, I came to know that they did not know the implications of the oath taken by the troops of Pakistan. Inverted commas closed. Number one. Number two, from Qaid-e-Azam to BB, whole the cream leadership was vanished away. पीछे कचरा बच गया. Number three, the politician what said, ये बाचा खान के अल्फाज हैं, खुदा का मजहब अमन और मोहब्बत है, ये जो तुम्हारे दिलों में मजहब के नाम पर नफरत भरते हैं, ये खुदा के नहीं शैतान के नुमाइंदे हैं. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One last question and then we got to go to the panel. Sorry, go on.
Thank you. So, I know this is a discussion on elections, but really in all of the discussion of this whole democracy phenomena, I'm wondering why we're thinking backwards. So, election is the epiphenomena. It's how people elect governments in a democracy. But democracy is actually how free people with choices share ideas and resources, and that's where the whole thing comes about, that in a democracy it's about the freedom of not just expression but of opportunities. Where in a country where about 80%, according to Planning Commission, nearly 80% of the economy is controlled by the government, there you will see very little space for opportunities. You'll see coercive use of religion to constrain choices. You'll see constrained elections and rigged elections. It's about economy and when are we going to actually open up and push for that. That's where the whole thing changes.
Thank you. The time guillotine hovers over our necks. Quick responses, please. Thank you.
Let me try to respond to the, very quickly, media question. I think yes, media has a very important role to play. Unfortunately, I think it's not always responsible. और ख़ास तौर से ये जो minorities के खिलाफ काफ़ी sensationalism और stigmatization media करती है, इसमें उनका काफ़ी negative role है. So it cuts. That's a that's a knife that cuts both ways. और इन्होंने जो सवाल किया जमहूरियत के बारे में, किसी भी मुल्क में really, honestly, actually, let me put it this way: democracy is not a perfect system. It is imperfect everywhere. Even in the place that you might expect it to be perfect, I promise you, it is flawed. And even leaders in those countries, in England, in America, जो भी नाम ले लें, I'm not sure that those leaders love democracy either. So it's not actually about how much our leaders love democracy, it's about us insisting on a system that forces them to behave in a way that responds to us and not to anything else. And that can only happen if we stick with the system.
And if we bring education in.
Well, obviously, there is more to say. Anatol?
No,
but just very briefly speaking, as a former journalist myself, I entirely agree. The media needs what is, let us admit, a very, very difficult mixture to maintain of, on the one hand, a capacity not just to raise issues and to pursue issues, because the media here, I think, has become quite good at exposing certain scandals and things. It isn't good yet at pursuing them and pursuing them and pursuing them in this dogged way until finally one gets a just result. But of course, this also has to be combined with some measure of responsibility, especially when it comes to, dare I mention the words, conspiracy theories, speculation, the creation of scandals. But yes, that comes out of education. And by the way, I would say, speaking as a former Western journalist, it's not just that the Western media has not yet got there, that in so many really frightening ways we're going backwards in the West. What that also indicates, of course, is that you never achieve democracy. As has so often been said, democracy is a work in progress, which has to be always defended and developed. On the economy, indeed, one of the problems here, I think, is that even parties to which one has sometimes looked for more radical economic reforms, because that's what they promised, because that's been the background that they've come from, have, alas, in many ways turned out to be quite comfortable in many ways with the existing system, or at least have shied away from annoying or infuriating or losing the support of all the people that they would actually have to challenge in order to bring about serious economic reform. That is something which, but the problem is, of course, that without a sufficiently large, not just middle class, but middle class, really engaged in formal economic activity, you're not going to have the pressure from society necessary to bring these changes about.
Clearly, 1 hour is insufficient to deal with the complexity, not only of the electoral process in Pakistan, its history, but with the democratic process, our anticipations from it. And I say this ironically when we are poised to enter one more summer of discontent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, panelists and audience, for being with us for this session. After the lunch break at 2:30 p.m., we will start the session News, Views, and Sensationalism, which will be moderated by Rashed, Rahman, and the panelists are Hussain, Farhan Bukhari, Naseem Zahra, and Lieven Panamenta. At 3:45 p.m., the session that was scheduled was author to author. This session has been replaced by a tribute to Sabine Mahmood. We hope to see all of you at 3:45 for this session as well. Thank you very much, everyone.